Hi, my name is Carolyn Summers. I'm a landscape architect and I volunteer my time with the Native Plant Center at Westchester Community College. I'm here today to talk about native plant gardening and animal-plant interactions that happen when you garden with native plants. The mission of the Native Plant Center at Westchester Community College is to educate people about the environmental necessity, economic value, and natural beauty of plants native to the Northeast. And we need to start the discussion by defining native plants. A native plant is a plant that evolved over millennia in the same habitat in which it is currently found. It grows without cultivation. Obviously, it's like a wildflower. It grows by itself. The term native plant requires a qualifier. You can't talk about native plants generically. You have to define the region to which the plant is native. Every plant is native somewhere. The substitutes for invasives that we will discuss, invasive exotic plants that we will discuss, are all plants native to the northeastern United States. That means that they co-evolved along with other wildlife as important parts of a complex web of life. This is native bee balm monarda in my garden, and in the Northeast it's native. Here's the same plant, bee balm, in an English garden where it's not native. And here are many Americans in English gardens. The English are very fond of our plants. We have asters. They're even growing skunk cabbage along a little stream here. And in the lower right-hand corner, we're showing some, let's see, we have Cornus canadensis, which is bunchberry, and the skunk cabbage I already talked about, and we have asters. So what is an exotic invasive plant, or an invasive exotic plant? It's recently introduced to new habitats. Now recently can mean as recent as 300, 400, 500 years ago with colonists. In terms of geologic time, 300 or 500 years is really a drop in the bucket. It spreads without cultivation, just like our natives, and it causes harm by displacing or smothering natives or by disrupting the natural processes. We all have exotic plants in our gardens. Some cause harm and some don't. Why some do and some don't has a lot to do with the reproductive characteristics of the plant in question. Many problem plants have berries that spread far and wide by migrating birds. Other plants have very aggressive root systems or twining stems. Plants with spreading roots are referred to as clonal or stoloniferous, and even some natives with this trait can be considered somewhat invasive, particularly within a small garden setting. What makes exotic invasives a serious problem is their lack of natural predators and differences in response to seasonal rhythms. Here we have some bittersweet vines that have pulled this tree right down. Now, thanks to Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, this region is completely being smothered in Norway maples. So you can see that even the great designers make serious mistakes. Norway maples are designed to take maximum advantage of limited available light, which is fine in Norway, given that they don't have a lot of sunlight, but it gives the Norway maples here in this region an unfair competitive advantage and disrupts natural processes in our native forests. As you can see from the photograph, the Norway maple is developing much more quickly than the red maple. The sugar maples are even further behind. The deep dark shade cast in early spring by the Norway maples prevents the natural process from occurring, the natural process of spring ephemerals, which complete their whole entire lifespan in a very short period of time. It robs the forest of nectar for the first insects in spring and the nutrient pulse that's given by the decay of the spring ephemerals in early summer. So, I've already started to answer the question, why garden with native plants, but let's review a little bit. We're reconnecting to the surrounding web of life, providing the only food and best shelter for most wildlife. It's definitely less maintenance unless you set the plants into a very controlled situation. And you're also preventing the accidental releases of alien pathogens, insects, and plants. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the whole issue of the chestnut blight, and now we have the hemlock woolly adelgid to deal with. Baby birds, such as these marsh wrens, can't eat seeds or berries and need lots and lots of insects to survive. But the pest-free trees and shrubs offered for sale by most nurseries won't produce any. And the reason for that, it's a complex issue, but But what we're finding out now, scientists are starting to see that most insects are very host specific. Over the eons, they have grown to only be able to tolerate the chemicals that are in the leaves of the native plants, because that's what they evolved with. So for insects to be able to grow and provide the food that our baby birds need, they need our native plants. One of the reasons why your exotic plants aren't bothered by certain pests is because those pests are our native insects, and they can't eat the leaves. So it's kind of a vicious circle we're setting up here by planting plants that the insects can't tolerate, and then the birds are having less and less food to eat. Even birds, even baby birds of bird species who eat berries, can't, when they have to feed their babies, the babies actually eat the insects. And that's one of the things that became clear to me only recently. And even hummingbirds, baby hummingbirds have to have insects. Even though they're going to grow up to be like their parents and eat nectar, in the beginning, their hummingbird parents have to find tiny little insects to feed them. So native plants really do provide the best source of food for wildlife, and in many cases the only source, as we're now learning. And so therefore indirectly they're predators. Many of you are familiar with the issue of host plants via the stories about monarch butterflies. Monarch butterflies require the plants in the milkweed family. That's the Asclepias family. And that's the best known example, but there are many other examples of caterpillars, butterfly caterpillars, that rely on a single genus of plants, and it includes many species, not related family members. For example, the monarchs, even though they can tolerate most all milkweeds, there is an exotic milkweed in the milkweed family called black swallowwort. It's a vine that's starting to become an invasive exotic. And the monarch mothers can be fooled by that plant, and they can lay their eggs on the swallowwort, and when the caterpillars hatch, they starve to death. So milkweeds also provide large quantities of nectars for many different butterflies. And these are just some examples of different color varieties that grow naturally in the wild. The Carner blue butterfly is an example of one of the butterflies I talked about that's limited to one species of host plant. The naturalization of western hybrid lupins on the East Coast spelled disaster for the Carner blue. The butterflies were fooled into laying eggs on the similar plant, but the caterpillars were not fooled. They also starved to death. Many species of violets make a fine ground cover, and violets not only provide a source of nectar for the earliest bees and other insects, but they are also host plants for fritillary butterflies. Butterflies need bee balm, which is the monarda, the plant I talked about earlier. And here we have many different butterflies. In the upper left, hoary edge, fritillary on the upper right, masses of fritillaries, and even a few others on the lower right on that little monarda plant. And on the lower left, everyone knows the tiger swallowtail. And this is a plant. This plant is very easily available at most any common nursery. This is the Eupatorium joe pye weed, and butterflies using joe pye. This is another great butterfly plant. Butterflies need the joe pies, and there are other Eupatoriums that are in that family. In the upper left, we have a pink joe pye. On the right, we have, it's joe pye, but it's a white cultivated variety, white joe pye. And then on the lower right, we have boneset, which is in the joe pye family, but it is a different plant. And on the lower left, a really rosy, colored-hued joe pye weed. So the butterflies also need to take their minerals. If you can provide some bare ground in your garden, you may see actually the butterflies puddling, it's called, especially if it's a little moist. In the upper left, they're on gravel. In the upper right, they've just found a little patch of clay that they're in. And on the lower right, they've actually found some dead leaves, and they're just sort of sucking up something that they need from those dead leaves. So now that we've kind of covered the butterflies, we'll talk about wetlands and the animals that need our wetlands. This painted turtle, not only does it need to be able to lay the eggs, I mean, not only does it need the water to live in, but it also needs to be able to lay its eggs, and it's not going to lay its eggs in water like our froggy friends. So the wetland laws, although they protect the actual pond itself, and they may some areas have laws that protect a little bit of an area upland of the pond itself. What they really need is they need safe passage. They need to be able to get from their ponds to a nice sandy dry area where they can lay their eggs. Because we have already lost so many acres of wetlands, every little pond is a beneficial habitat. This old farm pond has been dressed up with a native willow and some native water lilies. This is the same farm pond in late winter, early spring, filled with wood frogs, which make a funny quacking kind of noise, and their egg masses. They're one of the earliest frogs to come out and lay their eggs. The egg mass shown in the upper left is salamanders, and in the lower right, that's the wood frog egg mass. It's a little hard to see. They're very black, and they're very close to the surface. I have another little pond in my backyard in Hastings-on-Hudson, and it's just a tiny little thing that I put in one of those preformed ponds, and I was surprised to see that it has already attracted bullfrogs from a nearby park. Wood turtles are threatened species in New York, but can still be found in northern Westchester. They require streams to overwinter in with adjacent fields and woods for foraging and reproduction. Now, these two plants are hummingbird magnets. So if you like hummingbirds and you want them in your garden, these are two that you can really look for. Unfortunately, both of them are readily available at many of our best nurseries. The trumpet honeysuckle and the cardinal flower brought hummingbirds to my garden in Hastings. I have no idea how a hummingbird found my garden in the midst of all that suburban nonsense, but they did. Spirea tomentosa forms thickets that provide excellent hiding places for nesting birds. Studies show that nesting success is actually lower in exotic shrubs. The scientists don't exactly know why that is. It may have something to do with the branching pattern, but studies do show that if you want more birds nesting on your property, it's best to go with the native shrubs. And they can be very well disguised. That's the same bush, but from the outside of the bush you really couldn't see this nest, and I never would have found it if I hadn't followed the bird into the bush. Birds need berries for both spring and fall migration. On the left is the American cranberry viburnum, and upper right hand is a close-up of the same shrub, also showing some of the nice foliage colors you can get in the leaves. On the lower right is foliage and berries of wild raisin, which is Viburnum cassinoides. This is one of my personal favorites. I consider it really the queen of spring flowering trees. This is just your average, not particular cultivated variety, Cornus florida, flowering dogwood. And what it does in the fall is it has these spectacular berries. These dogwood berries are extremely high in lipids, which is the best type of nourishing fat for long-distance migrants. When we plant native plants, we are combating global homogenization. Surprisingly, when you do an inventory of widely spaced gardens nationally, and you look at garden centers nationally, we're pretty much planting the same 24 plants from coast to coast. In the next few slides, I'll introduce some of my favorite plants, and some of them you may know, some of them may be new to you. I'm even going to stick in a few purple-leaved plants for those of you who really like those crazy purple plants. These two side-by-side, red maple and sugar maple, are probably well known to most of us. They're a big part of our regional identity. This slide here shows just an ordinary forest edge in upstate New York with birches, maples, and a few hemlocks in the background. This is a wonderful tree, Tupelo, Nyssa sylvatica, and I think it was just given some kind of award. It's been around forever, but one of the gardening clubs just got around to making it the plant of the year, or tree of the year. And on the right is the red oak, Quercus rubra, and they have absolutely, both of them, magnificent fall foliage. The tupelo is actually quite glossy even in summer when it's a bright glossy green, and then it gets that same gloss on it with the red color, and it's very effective. Well, here's our first purple plant, porous pansy, the redbud. There is also a weeping variety of redbud called covey or lavender twist. Redbuds are in the pea or legume family. The flowers produce small seeds eaten by wildlife. It's also got those beautiful pink flowers in the spring. Another purple-leaved tree, this is a common choke cherry called Canada Red or Schubert. Most highly colored trees will produce the best color in full sun. This one is an interesting plant. It actually starts out with very kind of lightish green leaves turning to darker green, and then by early summer it's got this wonderful purple foliage which it keeps right through into the fall. Now you may notice that I've started talking about some cultivars or cultivated varieties. Those are just native plants that have been bred by plant breeders who pick the showiest usually, or interesting forms like weeping or dwarf forms, and they breed them and they sell them and they give them names, they give them pet plant names, and they're available at many of the better nurseries. Some gardeners will only want to plant native plants, the species themselves, and there are pros and cons which we'll discuss. The pros, they are readily available and they obviously have not been collected from the wild since they were specially bred. Some cultivars are more compact and better suited to the smaller garden, and a lot of us, especially in the suburban areas, our gardens are not acres and acres, and if you can choose between a 3-foot or a 6-foot plant, you might very well want to go with the 3-foot. They satisfy a gardener's quest for novelty and collectability. This is very important. I must have a zillion cultivars at one point or another that I've tried. They don't all last, but I'm one of those people who really needs to sort of experiment, and so I like the cultivars for that reason, and I think a lot of people do. They also present less of a threat to natural areas than some exotics. Obviously, if they get loose, they're still natives, and most of the time they'll revert and probably interbreed with their other natives, and so they're not going to cause a problem. Now, the negatives, the cons, they may lack genetic diversity. Some of them are clones of each other. Some double-flowered cultivars are sterile and cannot be used by pollinators. So if you have all double-flowered plants in your garden, butterflies may still come attracted by the showy flowers themselves, but they will not have any nectar. So it's good to mix those up. So plant a few double-flowered and a few of the species, and then you'll get your mix. The other con, they may come from southern populations and not be reliably cold hardy. That can be an issue in our region because many plant breeders are based in the southeast where the growing conditions are so much better. And so when we bring them up here, they're not always successful. This is another one of my favorites. American plum, Prunus americana, is my candidate for prettiest early spring bloomer. It also smells heavenly. Established plants produce small plums that are too tart for me to eat, but my daughter can, and they also are used for preserves. But the flowers are the best. It tends to be more shrub-like than tree-like unless trained, and will also sucker. Not such a problem in a mowed landscape or along a street. Incredibly tough, mine grows in the worst soil, and the deer don't seem to bother it. I can't ever say that anything is deer-proof. Probably all of you want to know, what are the deer-proof trees? Because every region is different, and the deer will get used to, now they're eating English ivy, so, I mean, you just don't know. But I will let you know as we go through these plants which ones have at least proven somewhat resistant to the deer in my neighborhood, and wild plum is one of them. I think it's a great substitute if any of you were thinking of planting Callery pear. It blooms right about the same time and has the same showy white flowers. This is the hypericum. There are many shrub hypericums. There are at least 3 or 4 different species, all of them native to the Northeast. And butterflies just love it. It blooms in the summer when not a whole lot else is happening. This one also seems to be slightly deer resistant. If any of you are thinking of planting burning bush, try blueberries, high bush blueberries instead. This is what the fall foliage looks like of the common blueberry, and then plus you get to eat the blueberries in spring. Another good substitute for burning bush, the sumacs. Most of you are familiar with the tall, kind of gangly sumacs, but there are some smaller ones that are called, there's glossy ones, and then there's the one with the winged leaf sumac, and both of those color up nicely in the fall and can be found at some of the better nurseries. This is American cranberry, one of many native viburnums to substitute for the invasive exotic viburnums. It's underneath the dogwood on the left, and that's a full-size one. There's a close-up in the upper right of the flowers. There is also a variety called Bailey's Compact for smaller gardens. Spice bush is the next plant. Spice bush is blooming right now. For those of you who are lucky enough to have the female, they do need male and females. These are the pretty yellow flowers. They bloom exactly the same time as forsythia, and I think it's a much nicer look. It doesn't quite hit you over the head. Spice bush female plants also produce the flowers and the bright red berries, which I don't have pictures of because so far the birds don't wait for me to get a good photo. They eat them so quickly. Similar to the dogwood berries, they're very high in lipids. The leaves are aromatic and seem to be somewhat deer resistant for that reason. The Brooklyn Botanic Garden lists spice bush as a great substitute for some of the invasive honeysuckle shrubs. Grasses are another really great thing to plant and are probably the most deer resistant of all of our plants. On the top left we have a mixture of Indian grass and Panicum virgatum, which is switchgrass. On the inset going across from left to right, that's Indian grass, that's the inflorescence, a close-up. They're very pretty plants, especially with the light. All of these plants look great in the fall when the light catches them in just the right way. On the upper right, we have switchgrass, another type of switchgrass with sort of bluier seed heads. On the bottom left, we have little bluegrass, the cultivated variety called the blues, and then some little bluegrass that has seeded itself into some rocks. And then on the lower right, we have an entire field of little blue stem that was grown from seed. New England aster is a really wonderful plant in the fall. What wonderful colors. And it works, it's such an intense color, and yet it works with so many of their other fall blooming colors. Works great with all of the yellows. It's another butterfly favorite, and it will bloom actually right until October. And they're wild all over along Route 17 in Orange County. So if you're driving up that way and you see this purple thing, that's what you're seeing. White snakeroot. This is by far and away the most deer resistant of all of the eupatoriums. And I actually had scads of it growing in my garden when I got very tired of the deer one year and just let the garden go to the deer. And this is pretty much all that they left me. It was an interesting experiment. It's actually a very pretty plant. It looks sort of cloud-like when there's a mass of it in bloom, and it will seed itself into all kinds of crazy spaces. Here you see it. It's seeded itself into my wall. There is a purple leaf variety called chocolate that's available at the better nurseries. The ones you see growing here are all volunteers from the woods. Speaking of volunteers, another wild plant that often volunteers in our gardens is daisy fleabane, Erigeron annuus. And it's a good reason to really look before you pluck, because sometimes your weeds may turn out to be a wildflower. They have this one has tiny little white daisies, and the effect is very similar to baby's breath. Here is a native plant commonly sold in nurseries, moss phlox, Phlox subulata. Many of you are probably familiar with this plant and with the fact that different colors have different names. Because they are propagated and grown or cultivated by nurseries, they are known as cultivated varieties, which we talked about earlier, cultivars for short. Plant breeders are allowed to name them. Sometimes the names are even patented, and when that happens, you pay more for the plant. But are they real native plants? Well, we've talked about that. I think that probably the pros, at least for me, the pros outweigh the cons. So after all this discussion of native plants, you're probably still going to be stuck with a few exotics, either that you inherited, or your friends will give you, or maybe you just can't resist. So let's talk about what's the best way to use them safely. One thing to do is to avoid plants that disperse seeds through wind or birds. Avoid plants that spread vegetatively, and you may want to even think about doing that with some of the natives, like goldenrod can be one of those plants that will spread rapidly vegetatively and take over an entire garden space. Limit the ability of cultivated varieties to reproduce by sticking with just one variety. The whole thing with cross-pollination really increases yields, and many of you know that from vegetable gardening. Well, the same thing is true with our garden varieties of our showier plants, and it's probably better to have just one cultivar, and you may get lucky, and it won't be able to self itself. Now, if your neighbor across the street, however, is planting the same exact plant but a different cultivar, then that doesn't quite work, but it's worth a try. Some plants have separate male and female, so if you plant only the males, for example, hollies and ailanthus, you won't have any problem with spreading. You can also plant tender annuals. They're not going to spread. Plant the tried and true antique flowers. Lilacs are an interesting plant. We have a long history of lilacs here in the United States. They were one of the first plants brought over, and they don't seem to spread at all. In fact, you can go out into the middle of the woods and see a foundation, and you can see the lilacs still growing right next to the foundation. So my last bit of advice on planting exotics, even though we really shouldn't, but if you must, please avoid being the first on your block to own weeping Chinese buttonbush or any other Chinese or Japanese thing that sounds exotic, because it probably is exotic. And if it's new, we just don't know what it will do. By the way, there is no such thing as weeping Chinese buttonbush. I just made that up. So don't go looking for it. Last but not least, I would like to also encourage you to invite the kind of wildlife that we show here on the right, attract those wildlife to our gardens too. Anything we can do to lure our kids out from behind the computer and the TV is well worth the effort. Well, thank you for listening. I hope this has been a worthwhile experience for you. If you have further questions about native plants, I encourage you to visit our website at the Native Plant Center, and the URL is listed at the bottom of the screen because I can't remember it. And we always try to answer questions and get back to people. And I'd also like to let you all know that on May 3rd, we'll be having our annual plant sale, and at least some, if not all, of the plants that I've showed and talked about today will be available for purchase at the plant sale at West Chester Community College campus. Thank you.